Hello, and welcome to the lecture on Fantasy and the Arabian Nights, Part 2. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the mode of fantasy and learning how it relates to the second part of Arabian Nights, which you'll be reading this week. So this week, we'll be looking at the opposite of realism, which is fantasy. We will return to the text of the Arabian Nights to examine how fantasy literature works as a mode. When authors write in the fantasy mode, they try to create a story that takes the reader out of the world as we know it. This means they will try to show you places and people that are unreal, impossible, and completely different from your own experiences, even if the story begins in more realistic terms. Stories that use fantasy often want the story to feel astonishing or fascinating. They usually incorporate magic, the supernatural, time travel, science fiction, make-believe, and other worlds. Some general principles to keep in mind about fantasy are: number 1, fantasy stories typically use the supernatural in some form: magic, time travel, characters from other worlds, and so on. Number 2, fantasy authors like to write about things that are impossible in ordinary experience in order to let readers escape from everyday reality. However, fantasy often contains overt allegories, lessons that parallel real life, in order to instruct readers. In this way, fantasy tries to make up for its impossibilities by showing readers how it can be used in life. Number 3, many fantasy stories deal with the characters, usually the heroes, quest for maturity and purpose, or with a character's journey to a different place or time. Number 4, some fantasy literature is serious, dealing with tragedy, death, and social problems, but a lot of it is entertaining too. It usually ends on a positive note, with the hero completing a quest, overcoming obstacles, bringing knowledge and understanding to him or herself and to his or her society. Fantasy literature can also be pure escapism, which means it's meant to be read just for fun. Number 5, fantasy is not considered as important in literary studies, even though it is more popular with the general public. Because it deals with the impossible, some people see it as less important to history and humanity than realism, which tries to depict true human experiences. Fantasy literature is often the most read outside of colleges and universities by the general reading public. Mainly, this happens because the term fantasy covers such a wide array of types of literature, which often get turned into movies. Star Wars is fantasy, The Lord of the Rings is fantasy, Harry Potter is fantasy, and all of these have book versions. Even movies like Blade Runner or The Minority Report started out as a type of fantasy, and we'll talk more about that in Unit 3. As I mentioned above, sometimes fantasy literature is serious, but often it is meant simply to entertain audiences. It doesn't have to be didactic, but at times authors will put in a lesson about good behavior to make the fantasy useful. Let's talk a little bit about the background of fantasy fairy tales and some of the controversy that has kept fantasy out of more serious literary study. One important thing to note about fantasy literature: initially, it was not meant for children, because people believed children were too impressionable and needed to be taught strict morals. While certain types of fantasy tends to be marketed to children today, even when read by adults, and you can think of Harry Potter here, originally fantasy and fairy tales were only read by adults. In fact, many fairy tales were incredibly violent and even overtly sexual. Over the years, the tales were edited to be more appropriate for publication, and eventually were edited even more to make them more appropriate for children. One well-known difference in an original fairy tale versus the version we have now is Cinderella. In the original, when the stepsisters try on the glass slipper, they cut off their toes and heels to try to make the shoe fit. The prince discovers they are lying because he sees the blood. Later, when Cinderella rides off with the prince, she instructs birds to peck out the stepsister's eyes in revenge for how they treated her. I think this example may help you understand why fairy tales were not for kids until they were cleaned up. In the same way, the Arabian Nights has a varied publication history. As I mentioned in the Part 1 lecture for the Arabian Nights, the history of its composition is complex. When it was circulated, literature in the Arabic culture was typically more serious, and the Arabian Nights was considered to be too light and in parts extremely offensive. And you can see some of this even in the text that we read. Over the years, the text was cleaned up, much like Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, and other fairy tales, and children's editions were eventually issued in the 19th century. Even now, when you think of the story of Aladdin, you might think of the Disney cartoon rather than a classic piece of Arabic literature from the early 13th century. So, fantasy writers have always confronted this essential tension. How do you use supernatural elements to tell a story if you want your readers to take it seriously at some point? Let's look at the Arabian Nights as fantasy. The Arabian Nights as a fantasy text blends more realistic elements, like the influence of the Islamic faith and Arabic culture, with more unrealistic elements of the supernatural, manifestations of demons, genie, magic, and extreme coincidence. Interestingly, you can see the real religious influence that existed in the Arabic world manifested within the text as the characters tend to invoke God's providence over their lives. Usually, the heroic characters are those that submit their causes to God, even when it doesn't seem that He is helping them at first. For example, when the fisherman keeps having ill luck as he pulls in his nets, he repeatedly appeals to God. This quality of his character grounds him as more realistic, especially for that time period, even when he subsequently encounters a demon, which is pure fantasy. Ultimately, he defeats the demon by using his reason, another detail that marks him as realistic, even in a supernatural encounter. He says, "He is only a demon while I am a human, whom God has endowed with reason and thereby made superior to him. I will use my reason to deal with him." By inserting these somewhat realistic elements, the authors of the Arabian Nights were able to use fantasy as a mode, creating characters and situations that were completely impossible, but they still showed that fantasy could have a purpose for readers. Almost all of the stories have obvious lessons that could be used by readers, just as we saw in the first section of our reading with both the Vizier and Shahrazad's tales. While fantasy writers have to try to show fantasy's value, not all fantasy texts do so. Some are written as escapism. The stories are told just for entertainment value, and writers and readers do not expect to learn anything from them. It may be that this is the reason why the Arabian Nights was temporarily banned. While much of it seems to be written with an allegory in mind, there are definitely sections that are told just for fun. As a whole, the stories contain so much fantastical elements that the text as a whole was categorized in this mode, which resulted in its suppression for a while. Now, however, scholars recognize the elements within it that make it an important part of Islamic and Arabic literature. Overall, much of pure fantasy literature still functions as escapism. We read Harry Potter because it takes us out of our reality, not because we can learn anything from it. Fantasy gives us imaginative pleasure, but in a way much different than most realist texts. So let's look a little more closely at this week's reading. This week I asked you to read the story of the fisherman. In addition to its fantasy elements, it also contains an example of a complex story within a story. Remember the frame narrative from our earlier discussion? Did you notice how many characters told stories within this tale? We're constantly descending into and out of a variety of stories, most of which are meant to demonstrate a concept or persuade the listener in some way. Why might this be important in the context of Shahrazad's story? Think back to part 1. Fantasy is supposed to take us away from reality, whether or not we want to read into it and discover a moral or lesson. Did you find that reading the Arabian Nights made you escape from your own life momentarily? What were those elements that either helped you or hindered you from doing so? The story of the fisherman shows how a normal, everyday experience can become something magical, unexpected, perhaps dangerous, but also entertaining once the supernatural is introduced. If the fisherman had simply caught some fish to eat or sell, the story would have remained in the realist mode. But the demon's presence changes both the fisherman's view of reality and our own experience of reading the story. Suddenly, we're not in the real, and we have to grapple with how to interpret something that does not cohere with what we know about the world around us. What do we do with fantasy as readers when it defines our experience of the mode? Do we discount it? Do we embrace it? Does it give us pleasure, or do we think it's a waste of time when we could be reading something more serious or more weighty? Pure fantasy, more than any other mode, calls attention to itself as a mode, and therefore we simultaneously have to consider both the action of the story and the experience of reading it. The conclusion of the fisherman's story ends happily, and the text continues on as Scheherazade begins yet another tale. The fisherman is able to experience and manipulate the supernatural to his advantage. Did you feel satisfied with this conclusion? Was reading about his fantasy experiences entertaining enough? Did you want more? Consider the influence of fantasy as a mode, the potential lessons for readers, and the structure of the story. Be sure to read closely and make some comparisons between the realist stories we've already read and the fantasy that we're reading this week. Thanks.